Hey, welcome everybody. I don't know who's coming in or who is going to be watching this later, but we have, I think, a pretty special session today. We're going to be talking about yeast, and we have some really experts on it from two different sides. So I'm going to start up here in the corner where I realize, as Liam pointed out, I did not put everybody's names on, which I should have done. But we have Jan from the Kromme Haring in the Netherlands. He's also the organizer of Carnivale Brettanomyces, which is probably the premier mixed fermentation brewing festival in Europe, I would say. Is that fair enough, Jan?
Yeah, I suppose I leave it to you.
Okay, well, approving there is Amund from Eik+Tid. So they're in Norway. You're basically, we can get into it later, but you're basically raw ale brewers with a very Norwegian focus, and you've kind of evolved your own in-house culture from different kveiks, as far as I understand, and you repitch your yeast all the time. So a lot of experience there. And then one side that I know I personally don't get any kind of information from, probably because I'm not big a cider drinker, is cider in yeast, yeast in cider. And the last time Liam was on, we have Liam here from Legacy Cider, and we have James from, I've just been corrected, it's not Legacy, it's Long Ways Cider. So again, I apologize for putting up the wrong message, but the last time Liam was on, we kind of did a little touch on yeast in the cider, and how that works. So I thought it would be interesting to bring in the cider look at things and see how it all kind of meshes or doesn't mesh with the brewing side and all of that. So that's basically our plan for the next hour, is just to have a chat about that. I thought maybe what we do is we kick it off. If I give my kind of potted knowledge of yeast, and you can then correct me all about where I've gone completely wrong in this, in my understanding of it. So, taking beer, most brewing up to the mid 19th century was using it. Each brewery had its own yeast, kind of in-house yeast culture, that I think it was repitching, and it was slowly evolving, and farmhouse brewers had their own one, and they kind of slowly evolved it into their own house cultures. And then Carlsberg kind of by necessity discovered how to isolate out the different strains, and instead of having mixed cultures, they were then using single strain yeasts that they would kind of preserve. They would maybe repitch a few times, and then they'd go back to the source and take that again. So that it went from being and that took off, that became kind of the standard outside of maybe Belgium and maybe the UK a bit. And outside of, outside of the Lithuania as well, where and north of places like Norway, North Scandinavia, isolated kind of farmhouse areas. And if I'm right, then basically everyone started using the same yeast. It became much less complex, and it became single strain. Do I have that right? Is that a good potted history?
I think you have it right partly. I think when Carlsberg started using their own, isolate their strain, they start using it. Many breweries start using that, or at least a technique, and came up with at least similar strains. But this whole culture is not only in Norway or Lithuania, but Belgium as a great example, but also Great Britain, which you did mention. They obviously kept making top fermenting beers all through the 20th century. And these are not the strains that Carlsberg isolated. These are, still I can't tell, but very often still their own strains from their brewery. So
yeah, so
hard, I suppose. But if you're talking about lager, definitely major brand lagers, then you're definitely correct.
Okay.
Can I just ask, guys, because I don't know much, to be honest, about brewing. I just it's all cider. But guys, when you're using yeast, is it like, this might seem a very basic question, but is it this, once you get your brew and once you're selling it, is it the same yeast all of the time that you use then? And is there absolute as much consistency as you can in that batch, or does it change using the same yeast?
Are you asking if using the same yeast for every different beer we make?
No. So say, for instance, you're doing a lager, and one style, and then you use a particular yeast through your bench trials and your experimentation. You've decided on one particular yeast, or brand of yeast. I presume you use the same as us. Does that, do you continue using that all the way through, and does it give you consistency, or do you have to change it?
If you if you repitch yeast, I think that's your question. So use the very same yeast from batch number one, so to speak.
Yeah.
And harvest that and use the batch number two. You'll, over time, depending on the strain, find differences. And it's something consistency is a great thing, obviously, but it's something you might want to aim for too. You can say, if you were saying lager, it's a great example. As in, I find out the lager strain we use is becoming attenuates much slightly better after a few runs, after a few beers. If you
Okay.
That's
Okay.
something I'm very keen of personally. So I like doing that. But we, again, personally at our brewery, we don't yet manage to keep that thing active enough or active enough or clean enough. We don't manage to keep that for, say, 20, 30, 40, 50 times. At some point, we have to renew and therefore have, again, a slightly different attenuation. So yeast does change.
Okay. Well, my question was that do you, like, once you have a commercial yeast, if you are starting with a commercial yeast, do you continue with that same commercial yeast again? But you've answered my question. You try and harvest it as much as you can, do you?
We try and harvest it as much as we can if that's the desired profile we want from that yeast.
Yeah.
If we know we like it better, attenuating slightly better for whatever reason, taste mostly, then we try to do so. If we think it shouldn't attenuate much deeper, then we gotta take a fresh pitch.
Okay.
If you get it.
But that, like, I think that's how it would have been throughout most of the history, though, is it that, like, the yeast always, it evolved. It became domesticated, I guess, in many ways, because you'd harvest it from the beers you liked, but you'd ignore the ones that maybe didn't work out as well. So you'd be slowly evolving the yeast to your taste.
Yeah.
I can tell you a little bit about how we do it, because we have actually never bought yeast.
Okay.
Any yeast that is in the brewery is gifted to us by someone who's kept it, usually a Norwegian farmer. And what they usually do is they brew, and then they top harvest after 48 hours from the top of the brew, and they dry it, and then they keep it for the next time they brew. What we do is that we keep the culture separate from the brews. So I have 2 starters, and then always have a backup in case one fails. And I pitch those and fill it up with wort and keep it separate. So I actually never harvest the yeast from the actual beer we make. I just keep like a separate small starter of beer going all the time. And of course, it's happened that we've gotten infections or it has drifted because we are mixing strains together that haven't been working together before. And these are multi-strain sacks with Saccharomyces cerevisiae. with some lactobacillus in it, naturally. And of course, we aren't doing the same thing as the farmer brewers are doing to this culture. So sometimes it just goes a different direction. And then we just restart it because we always have backup.
Okay.
Okay, and but the farmers, again, I'm basically going, pretty much my knowledge of yeast is pretty much what I've read, what Lars Garshol has written and kind of documented. So that's pretty much my whole knowledge comes from him. But
that's a good place to get your knowledge about kveik.
It's yeah, I cannot disagree with you there. But yeah, so I mean, what you started with is like, just take, because he's done it, like the kveik, yeah, and you've taken a collection of different kveiks and you kind of meshed them together to get your starter that you keep using. But throughout what those kveiks would have come from was they would have, did they always keep it that way? Or because I understood that, you know, it was nearly always harvested again and then it slowly changed and it kind of evolved, and that they didn't really keep this backup. Is that, am I wrong?
I mean, there's a lot of stuff we don't know about where it came from or how it is evolved, but we do know how to keep it today. The farmers that have gotten these cultures from their ancestors, and Norway being a quite poor country, we never had a culture of brewing continuously. So it was brewing for Christmas, maybe brewing for some weddings, but 2-3 times a year. And you had to keep this yeast in between those months, right? And what they figured out is that it was perfect to dry these cultures. So they would top harvest, like I said, after 48 hours, and they would put it on a piece of cloth or wood with a little surface area, and they would just hang it up to dry. And the yeast would dry, and then next time they wanted to use it, they just use this dry yeast log as a starter, or this cloth, or what it would be. And the interesting thing is that all these Norwegian West Coast kveiks are related. They're part of the same family, and they have an ancestor that actually is distantly related to Weissbier yeast, and also an unknown other parent. So there is a mutation at some point in history with an unknown parent, and this yeast that came from Europe, we don't know how it came from Europe or when, but it's definitely hundreds of years ago, and we don't have an explanation how it spread to all these farms. I mean, the geography of Norway is pretty extreme, so to get this yeast to travel all these places, it is still a bit of a mystery, and it's super fascinating. But the icing on the cake here is that they managed to keep this yeast alive until modern age, because this was something that every farm had if they brewed beer. I mean, spontaneous fermentation is quite risky, and if you're brewing for a wedding, you're brewing for something that's happening in a few weeks, and you have to have beer at that event, and it has to be good. And if you're just gonna let nature take its course in that way, you can have fantastic beer, as we all know, but it's much less predictable than keeping a culture.
And yeah, and then you have to kind of keep it and blend it. Whereas with the kveik, I suppose they knew what beer they were getting, or they were pretty close to it. They weren't going to have to then go into blending and trying to.
Yeah. And I mean, they didn't make beer for keeping. If you're going to understand this culture, you have to take away the part of our brain that takes shelf life for granted, takes stability for granted, because this didn't exist. I mean, of course, this beer would go sour, it would go stale, but they finished it long before that. They started drinking when they harvested after 48 hours.
Right.
And even today, if I ask a farmer brewers, how do you know when the beer is ready, when it's done, like when it's stable? What do you mean done? It's done when it's empty. So they don't have this concept of fermenting to stability and making sure the shelf life so it can survive for X amount of months or a year, right? This concept doesn't exist in this culture.
Okay. Yeah, and you mentioned, sorry, you just mentioned there, like when they dry it, did they? So these cultures, And you mentioned like bacteria in there and lactobacillus and that. So did that dry with it, or would that just come in from the air, or like?
Well, amazingly enough, most of them don't have bacteria at all.
Okay.
So there are just a few where they found some bacteria, and I know that. Well, the thing is that most of the yeast labs that have looked at these strains, they are yeast labs. So they've been looking at the yeast, but no one has been looking at the bacteria. So we don't really know much about the bacteria yet. I have heard that one of the labs have identified one of the lactobacillus as a lactobacillus that's common in milk fermentations. Maybe there's some cross-contamination at some point. Maybe they were using some similar equipment. I have no idea, but they seem to be working in a symbiosis. But the interesting thing is that the culture we use now, because we only actually have one farmhouse culture in our culture now. And when the farmer, Stig, brews with this culture, his beer is not sour. But
Okay.
when we brew with it and we age it, it turns sour. So the way he brews and the way he kind of treats the beer and when he serves it makes it a non-sour beer brewed with a mixed culture. So that's kind of amazing.
Is this different origins than just using more hops, basically?
Yeah, well, they don't use
Like
a huge amount
Bacillus.
of hops because it's raw beer, so they don't even boil the hops. They might make a small hop tea out of water and hops, but usually I've seen them just put hop flowers in a sith, in a basket sith, and then they run the wort through that when they run off the wort. So we're not talking a significant amount of alpha acids here to inhibit the bacteria either. So I'm thinking it's more about the way they brew, and also, of course, that they start drinking it pretty early on and finish it while it's still fresh.
Can I come in there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just on the cider side of things there, we've been using both commercial and wild yeast. We've been pitching commercial yeast and we've been trying to identify wild yeast. Now, I find that the wild yeast can create very funky flavors in some of the ciders, and it's difficult for us to get nice consistency and a nice product from some of the wild yeast. But we have isolated 2 wild yeasts in the cidery there in the last 2 years, and what I'd be interested to know is what your opinion is on trying to harvest this wild yeast. So please forgive me, I've been kind of working on the blind in this. So what we've done in 2 separate occasions. So first, when we do the initial fermentation, we get the heavy lees at the bottom of the tank, and then we'd rack off once the fermentation is finished, and then we get a selection of fine lees then I would say at the end of the second racking, you know what I mean? Now, my thinking is that the heavy lees, the first racking would deliver you a much more complex type of yeast range. Plus, you'd also have off flavors coming from different types of yeast in that. Plus, you'd have maybe a bacterial load that could be there. Whereas in the second racking with the fine lees, that you'd actually get a cleaner yeast profile there coming through. It's interesting to listen to how you collect your yeast. You put it in your top fermentation beers. You put either stick in or a piece of cloth in, and you dry that, and then you use that to pitch. And the next time, I'm wondering 2 things. Number 1, how would you harvest your yeast from the lees? And number 2, would you think that if we put a cloth into our cider or a stick into the cider, would we manage to pull the right yeast from that to the next, to pitch on to the next time?
Well, this is a very complicated question, but I'll try to answer as best as I can. We actually do make ciders as well. We spontaneously ferment, just like for fun, because we know a guy who runs an apple orchard. But I mean, if your yeast will have a good flocculation ability, which usually wild yeast doesn't, because that is the domestication tray. But if it flocculates, then it will probably drop to the bottom with the heavy lees. So you might have less amount of cells on the final yeast later on. So yeah, it could be a way of selecting for something, but how would you know what you were selecting for? If you like the flavor of that particular ferment, like that particular cider, I would try to draw samples before you rack each time and grow them up with some apple juice and just smell and taste and see if there is any difference. And if there is, then you have managed to separate at least the balance of the culture a little bit, because I mean, there's still going to be cells coming along, but different yeast will have different preferences, and if they drop out early on, then you have to get them early. If they are late survivors, then you can have them later on while the other ones have dropped out. So, but it is a pretty difficult way to select for like a certain strain. It's impossible, but for a culture, yes, you can do this.
Yeah. So what we've actually done up to now is that we'd when we're racking off, we'd actually rack. We say once racking off is finished, and then you've got kind of we say if you take a 1,000-liter IBC, we'd maybe have 3 centimeters of lees at the bottom. So we try and take off the top piece, the one that was closest in contact with the cider, into a 5-liter drum, and we put that in the fridge, and we'd use that then the next time. And we've had some quite good carryover with ones that we particularly like, but it's what I'd love to do is kind of cement the ones that I like, you know what I mean, that we can keep them in the cidery to keep them alive, because one of the ones we have this year, and Liam would comment on this as well, that we've won there this year is absolutely fabulous, like, and it's thrown off as a lovely character cider, you know what I mean, that it's quite difficult to get a commercial yeast to deliver the same complexities, roundness and flavor profiles that we're getting from this one. Now, I mean, admittedly, we've done a good lot of wild yeast fermentations to come up with just one at the minute that we think would suit our palate. Like,
can I ask you, do you age on wood at all, like on oak?
Yeah, we don't necessarily age in wood. So what we do is we actually get we age in whiskey barrels that we get from one of the local distilleries, and that's after turning out pretty fabulous, some of the ciders from that. Because
that is a way of capturing a culture you like, right? If you have a cider that's turned out really perfectly with the wild culture, and you put that into a barrel, chances are that this culture is going to take start to live in the barrel. So then you take that out, and the next time you have a cider, maybe even not all the way fermented through, just put it on that barrel, and the chances are that the culture from the last one will still be in there and start making that flavor again. So that's a lot what we do here. I mean, we have these big 2,200-liter oak tanks behind there, and all the way down to 200-liter barrels, and they contain the cultures that build the flavors of our beers, basically. So we do primary with the kveik strain, but that's basically our workhorse. That's just to ferment out and get the primary fermentation going. But like the maturation with the longer development of the complexity, that happens in wood. And that's where like the complexity of different yeast and bacteria live together and in opposition to create this certain flavors that you just can't do with a single culture, right?
That's correct. Actually, I'll come back to that point in another minute. Just one question on the barrels there. Are your barrels charred then on the inside, or the non-charred barrels that you start out with, like?
I don't know. They're not charred. Like, they're toasted. We don't use bourbon barrels much because
but they are toasted.
Yeah, they're toasted. Yeah. These behind there are
heavy or light.
Sorry?
Would it be a heavy or light toasting that you would give me?
I don't actually know, but I'm guessing it's quite light for these big ones. And we wouldn't be looking for a very heavy one. I mean, we could do for flavoring wise, but most of the wood we use is basically for the micro-oxidization that happens in the maturation, where you have the reductive flavors coming out a bit and oxygen coming in a bit, but not too much, so you get too much acetic.
Yeah.
And of course, a place to live for the cultures.
Of course, then that depends on the type of wood, like, you know, like the grain of the wood that you're using for the micro-oxidization. But just coming back, one of the trials that I've been trying to do is assess commercial yeast, you know, based on their characteristics, we say. So looking for ones that would give me structure, ones that would give me a flavor profile, and ones that would give me aroma, right? And then we'd make a base juice, apple juice first. Then we'd split that out into 3 different parts. We then pitch in with each individual yeast that was trying to give us the parts we want, like we say, one for structure, one for aroma, one for taste profile. And one of the biggest challenges we have here is trying to develop this long taste, you know, this nice long taste at the back of your mouth there when you're drinking a cider, you know, to give us that finish, you know, which can be quite challenging. But then re-amalgamate those 3 ciders at the first racking, you know, so that they start to mature together to develop the complexities that you try to achieve there with a wild yeast fermentation.
How did that work?
Yeah, some of it has worked very well now. I have one on this year. I was very, very impressed with it. Like I did one last year now, and I wasn't so impressed. It comes back then to the yeast strains that you're using, and trying to select the yeast strains that you think will deliver what you're looking for as a cider maker or a beer maker is the challenge. Like, and now the first ones I used last year, I wasn't happy with some of the strains. That I have done it again this year. As the problem that we have is against the beer guys is that we only have apples once a year. We're like the wine business. We can only ferment in October, November because we're using natural juice. We're not using any concentrate or anything like that. So we just do it once a year. So we kind of get one shot every year to do this, which is a pain in the butt because you'd like to do more work, like, you know. But this year then we selected, I actually did a 4 cider trial this year. Oh, sorry, a 4 yeast cider trial this year. And at racking off, I selected 2 of them I would use again next year, and the other 2 I would move out and try with 2 more then next year again, see can I develop the flavor. Now what I've got this year is very clean, very crisp. Doesn't bring enough character in the cider. I feel we're lacking that bit of character, and needs a bit more body to it.
Are these cider yeast or beer yeast? Or?
No, we're working mainly off white wine yeast, or it depends on the apple variety. So if I'm using the dessert apple variety, I tend to go for say a white wine type yeast, right? If we're using bittersweet, you know, apples that would have a high tannin origin tend to move towards a red wine yeast, you know. So you're looking at the pot, trying to work out what they're using. Say Melbach is an Argentinian wine that contains a lot of tannin. What kind of yeast are they using in the making of that Melbach? And then transfer that knowledge over then towards looking at the bittersweet apple, which have a lot of tannins in them. Would that red wine yeast work better? Of course, then if we're making champagne style ciders, then you're looking for a champagne yeast because you want the in-bottle fermentation then as well, you know, the secondary fermentation, and you want good fluctuation in that bottle so that when you do to go to disgorge it, that it pops out easily, like, you know, that kind of way.
Interesting.
So let me jump in here. So yeast. I don't think it used to get an awful lot of attention. I'm trying to train it off. Too much coming at me.
Will we start again, Brian? Give you a chance to recover.
I'm all confused. There's too much technical stuff for me. No, but I'm going to try and bring it back around to something back into what I understand a bit. So, I mean, if we went, Jan was saying, like, mainly lagers especially, were like it's single strain yeast. You went from a complex yeast to these single strain, and now we're all kind of looking back towards complex cultures again. Where do you think that's come about? Whereas, why has that interest? Like I said, it's always been in Belgium, England, and probably some other areas. But I mean, why has it now come back around? It's now become a whole huge interest again. And
Yeah, I'll jump in there just for a quick comment on that one. I was discussing this with other people before, like, and they were saying, you know, so if you're using a commercial yeast of one strain, like, they compared it to like an orchestra. So if you go to an orchestra, there's many musicians in the orchestra. They're all playing different instruments, right? And that brings the beauty and the complexity to the orchestra. If you're using one singular type yeast, you're only listening to the trombone, or you're only listening to the violin, or you're only listening to one particular instrument within that fermentation. Whereas if you can bring more, you bring more complexity by using different yeast structures, whether it's what I was trying to do in the experiment there, or what the gentleman here beside me is doing with wild yeast. You know what I mean? So, and actually, if you take a wild yeast in cider, there's about 4 or 5 distinct types of wild yeast in the cider that come in at the start of the fermentation, but they die out depending on the alcohol levels that are achieved during the fermentations. And then you end up, you know, at the end with the last yeast fermenting out the last of the cider would be completely different to the first yeast that started the cider fermentation, if you understand. So it's trying to develop the complexities within the product is what we're trying to do.
when you say it dies out, do you mean that it would all literally be dead? So that if you harvest that yeast, you were saying then you wouldn't have like if you harvest what comes at the end, you've lost.
Yeah. You see, this is part of the challenge in harvesting a wild yeast. So like, I don't have the names of the particular yeast in my head right now, but like I know some of them start to die out at 2 and 3% alcohol. But in the hope would be that, you know, right, they drop out to the bottom and they're in the lees, that maybe they didn't fully die, like that they may become dormant, and then that if you take that on again, you'll be able to use it on the next. I'm not technical enough, or I don't have enough knowledge to say that they're completely dead or to say that they're alive. I just don't know. I'm just hoping that we would pull them through in a 5-liter drum, like.
Yeah, what do you think, Jan? Is like, does that make sound right for, say, brewing as well? That, you know, if you're taking your yeast, you have your complex culture. I just had never kind of thought about this, about, you know, certain ones will be dead, and then
I guess they would be dormant rather than dead.
okay.
Also, from your statement, I think many of those Belgian or British breweries, they also use a single strain yeast. It's just not that typical lager strain you always see around. Not per se, but I think it's important to mention that single strain is a very common thing to do, and there are also really great single strains out there. So it's not a bad thing. But if you take away all the great romance about yeast, and there is plenty, and I love it. You can also look at it as a certain tool. So if you use a yeast blend or different pitch one yeast and decide to or by recipe decide to add a different yeast after a few days or weeks or even months, you could say that I would say something similar. His kveik yeast is his working horse. Just brings down. It just ferments out most, and then there is few sugars left, and then whatever is in his wooden barrels can start play with that. That can be a choice, and it just indeed gives a certain complexity you might be looking for. As simple as, again, not very romantic. It's just a tool or an ingredient in that sense. So we use Saison blends. It's our house blend, as we call it, with different Saison strains in there. And one is very much for that more peppery as well as fruity flavors or estery flavors. And one is simply to dry out that beer to the bone. So
Okay.
that's the reason to use more strains. Of course, the more ingredients or the more strains you use, the less predictable your beer will be, or the less consistent, perhaps, as well. So that's doesn't mean it's not consistent, but less consistent. So that's a choice you can make, and that's probably why I don't want to put it black and white, but those commercial big brands you were naming earlier, that's why they choose for one clean strain, which does exactly predictable what it has to do.
Right. So it's very much, yeah, when it comes out of the tank, you know what it's going to taste like, and
That's a fair choice too. If that's a great beer, then they did well.
yeah.
If it's not a great beer, then different discussion.
I think just to try to answer your question from my point of view as well, because it's a very good question. Why are these sort of wild ferments coming back into fashion, or even keeping a mixed culture or a house culture? I think in one word, it's down to diversity. Because, I mean, I was born in the early 80s, and I have definitely grown up on fermented food and drink that was all made with single culture strains. And I think that's I know that that's even more ubiquitous today. So if you hand someone a glass, and it might be natural wine, it might be a scrumpy, it might be a mixed fermentation beer, it might be a kimchi, a bowl of kimchi, it might be a sake, something with a mixed fermentation or a spontaneous fermentation. It's this set of flavors of complexity and sort of kind of extreme flavors that people aren't used to. So it's this shocking experience, like this you call acquired taste in English, right? You have to have it a certain amount of times to enjoy it. And these sort of blended fermentations where you have a lot of microorganisms making different acids and different esters and alcohol and acetic acid and all that stuff, that's just not present if you buy a fermented product from a big industrial company. And there's a good reason for that, because they want to make a product that's easy to reproduce, and they also want to make a product that a lot of people like. But the success of that method has pushed these sort of mixed fermentation products out into the fringe. And as anything, when people rediscover this, it's curious souls out there will be enthusiastic, and they will jump on their little soapbox and they will say, "Hey, you need to try this. This is totally bloody different. It's mind-blowing." And then you get some people into that, and that will grow. I think that's what you're seeing. You're seeing in cider, you're seeing in beer. You're definitely seeing it in food fermentation, like Noma and those chefs playing around with everything from koji to making their own vinegars and that sort of stuff. And I think it's all about that true flavor diversity, basically.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That, yeah, I mean, I suppose it is just the artisan, like you said. It's the diversity. It's the difference from what you're used to tasting and all of that. But do you think that sounds like you think it's been driven a lot from the producer more, and then slowly from the
if you start a mixed fermentation brewery, you're not doing it to get rich. It's not a great business idea. So yes, I think those sort of special fermentations that often they take time as well. I mean, turnaround for a beer for us, like a fruit beer, it's 3 to 4 months in wood, and then it's a couple of months at least on fruit, and then a couple of weeks re-fermentation in the bottle. So I mean, it's not this fast-moving consumer good type of product. So I think that, yeah, of course you have a following, but producers that choose to do this and like spend a lot of time, money on it, they have to be a certain kind of crazy.
And yeah, but I mean, I do see, like I said, it is becoming more popular, and you do see it. You know, lambics have suddenly shot up in popularity again, and that's probably the most extreme version of wild yeast around. But also, like I do see, you know, the yeast that's being used get mentioned more. Maybe not like on the main large brands, but you do see, the yeast getting listed alongside, say, the hops now or something like that. So it's slowly there, and you see kveik mentioned. People are very excited about it. So it seems to be that yeast is getting in the beer side. But Liam, I don't see any of that on cider bottles. There's no mention of yeast mentioned. Is that something that there's a potential market for, or?
I'm not sure. To be honest, I think we're still kind of around with yeasts, and there's no real dominant yeast. In a secret in relation to the yeast that we'd use, and we don't let it out. James and myself now are really going through a journey with yeast, and we've used quite a number of commercial yeasts, and we're kind of going through them and going through the ones that work and the ones that don't work. I'd say we've gone through almost, I don't know, 35, 40 yeasts, and out of that we've only really identified 2 of them that are good, and they're only for certain apples, as James was saying. But really, where we would like to go to is to start to harvest our own yeast. We go through the ciders now during the summer, and once they've kind of fully matured, and sometime in May or June, and we're tasting all of those, and generally out of about 30 or 35 different ciders that have been singly fermentation, there'd be about 2 of them, maybe 3, that would be outstanding, and they're the ones then that we would try to reharvest those yeasts and use them again for more of the ciders. But our challenge, as James was saying, was how to reharvest it, and whether to start with the kind of the first racking, which is the really heavy sediment, or the second racking. So that's our challenge at the moment. But in relation to yeasts, and to answer your first question, it's highly complex, consumers wouldn't have a clue, not a notion.
There's no potential to have lambic cider spontaneously fermented.
We'll put that on the list of NPD. Long list, Brian.
Well, but lambic producers don't mention their yeast. Well, their yeast, their spontaneous fermented beverages, but they don't make a huge fuss about that either. Actually, but they will tell you it's spontaneously fermented, and that there is commercial lambics where it might be not the case. But lambic producers also mostly focus on the end product, possibly similar to what, as far as I know, winemakers, for instance, do. They don't. It's very obvious what they do. Well, obvious as in it's spontaneously fermented, and it's very obvious that they do it differently than more industrial, commercial, or modern time breweries, cideries, wineries. But they don't make a huge fuss about that either, actually.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to ignore that it's a different beast, right? They don't have to say much when you try a lambic.
It's hard to ignore for definitely for us 5 here, maybe.
I'm talking about the flavor. If someone tries a lambic for the first time, it's very obvious that this is a different beast, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But then, if let's bring it to natural wine then, where this is often the case as well, spontaneously fermented, or at least using not those commercial strains winemakers are using as well, or killing those off at some point and all that. If you're just a consumer, somebody who drinks wine every day or every weekend, and then you get a natural wine, and you probably don't know much else than, oh, this tastes different, and I like it or I don't like it, but you won't know that yeast is. You won't know that yeast is in play because it's not your daily life, basically.
Yeah, and exactly, and that is exactly the point. Because all of us guys, we're in there. If you're a brewer or a cider maker, and you're working so hard and making the product as perfect as you can, and getting those small little inches, just increasing it. For instance, we age one of our ciders now in a barrel, in a bourbon barrel, and there's each time we do a blend, we have certain commercial products, And when they run out, we do another blend, and it's always different because cider is like wine; it's aging. The apples are different and all of that. So there's always a slight difference, and you're trying to marry the old one with the new one, and it's inevitably just it's like that. So you need to kind of blend them and bring them as close as you can, which doesn't always happen. But and we're always have that bit of nervousness then going to the market with your new with the new blend that you know, it's not so much a new blend, it's exactly the same formula, but it's different. And I'd be there going, oh my god, there's far too much oak in it now, or the bourbon is different, or it's just a little bit more acidic, and off. And you bring it out, and like I'd ask the guys then, fellas who would know, I say, hey, what do you think? Did you get that extra note of oak in it? We aged it in a much younger barrel. And hey, listen, Liam, I don't have a clue, man. Listen, I just drink it back, you know. They just, you know, different.
It's a great side of the consumer spectrum, and
Yeah.
I'm not a marketing guy at the brewery. Thank God I'm not, but I'm always very much in favor of telling people literally everything, not because they deserve to know, but because they need to know to respect the product much better.
Yeah.
Educate them.
Yes. Yeah. I know.
Really, I mean, it starts with what we do, putting every single ingredient on our labels, and not just yeast, but which yeast we use, or which malt we use, or whatever, and all that. And most people obviously don't care, and that's why I'm so depressed of life. Mostly, that's the reason. But I think it's people who want to know, or even don't know they want to know, but they will know. I mean, it's don't hold back. Educate them. That's what I.
I think that's probably the point, isn't it? To try and educate them, and as you say, people who don't know, but they might want to know about it.
And I wouldn't simplify things either. That's personally. Again, I'm not a big marketeer here. Thank God.
No, but it's just a point in relation to yeast, and like if you use a different yeast on a cider, like if you use it on a wine, it's a marginal difference for yourselves. Now you can have a wide variance if you use very extreme yeasts, but if we use yeasts that are different, even James, it's not so much a red wine yeast and a white wine yeast, but like the difference in the white wine yeasts are very marginal, and I don't think consumers would really know. We would, but consumers would.
Yeah, but you make them aware of the difference being there, and even if they can't taste it in the final product, they at least are aware of you playing with that and therefore making a good cider or not good cider. I suppose good cider. I trust you on that.
Liam,
it gives them an entry to learn more about the product and therefore, be a better consumer.
Yeah, I was wondering, for your yeast R&D, are you cooperating with some sort of yeast lab?
Is that to me?
No, for the cider guy.
No, we're not working specifically with any cider lab. No. Yeah, go on, Liam. Yeah.
Because that could be an interesting avenue to explore, especially with finding yeast from your own wild fermentations, right?
Yeah, I suppose that the problem we have in Ireland is that accessibility to a lab of that nature might be challenging, unless you're like the bigger companies, and the big cider companies in Ireland might have that facility to isolate the different yeast strains within a wild yeast.
I think, James, I think there's I can't remember their name, but there is a big lab work with a lot of the brewers, Black Donkey. Now they isolated their own yeast and worked with. There's a lab that does a lot of work for it.
That wouldn't be the Alltech people, would it?
No, I think it's so. I can't remember off the top of my head now, but I know that there was some lab. Someone mentioned to me. I can look for it afterwards, but there is some that
It'd be fierce interesting to find that out. Can I just turn the the conversation slightly different for a minute, if you don't mind, Brian. I'm just wondering about temperature, lads. What do you think about temperature and yeast and fermentations?
Yeah, well, I can say for our kveik workhorse, it's a bit different because these farmhouse yeast have traditionally been pitched at about for anywhere from 35 to 40 C. So our primary fermentation, depending on season, will be at a pitch temp from 36 to 40 degrees. So but that's very particular with the kveik yeast. That's one of their unique traits, actually. And it creates these beautiful esters, but not any fused alcohols or anything. So that's pretty amazing, and that also it has the added benefit that we don't need temperature control at all. Like I just adjust for the seasonal temperature a bit, but then I just ferment in IBCs, and we have one stainless steel pressurized tank, and that's for bottling. So that's the kveik saves us a lot of money on fermentation tanks.
But that's massive temperatures. But you have the advantage there that the wort is coming off a boil, isn't it? And you can see where the wort comes down from the boil. Then you can actually pitch your yeast at the right temperature. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Whereas we would have to heat the cider quite a lot, and would cost a lot of money to heat up the cider to 35, 40 degrees. Like
I don't think that will do anything positive for your cider fermentation either.
Like, I mean, I've had a cider out there at the weekend there, or during the week, like, and it was in an IBC. It was at 3 degrees when I was taking off an ice cider, and I was trying to heat it to 15 degrees C to put pitch in the yeast. Like, bloody hell, it took all day to heat it up, you know. Now, I mean, I have an industrial type immersion heater to do it, like, but geez, still took all day to heat it, like.
You don't want to do it with fuel costs these days.
No, you know, so, like, I mean, what we're trying to do there in the cider is create a low and slow fermentation is always what they recommended to do, right? And the real issue I have with low and slow with the commercial yeast is most of them like to run along between 18, 20, 22 degrees C, like. And I've isolated a few yeast that will happily work at around 10 degrees. Now, some of them will work lower, but the problem is they start to throw off a lot of off flavors that you don't want coming through in the cider. Like because the yeast are actually just stressed from the coldness of what they're trying to work in. Like, and that's why I was coming at temperature and how do you find temperature, and does it really deliver what they say it delivers when you get it at, you know, say 18 degrees? Is it delivering all the flavor profiles, the complexity of flavor from that single strain yeast, the mouthfeel and stuff like that? Do you find that the temperature at fermentation is very critical?
Jan, you use different cultures, so you
use different cultures. Critical. Well, I aim for certain temperatures, and now actually yesterday we brewed a strong Saison, 8% Saison beer, so it's a dry, very dry, only Saccharomyces fermented beer, about 8% in alcohol. And I was thinking it was becoming too estery, too fruity, if you like, and we decided to, for a while, now a bit more drastically, decided to go from, it was at 28 normally fermentation temperature, really kept it at 23 or so, and I can see what that gives, but that's definitely something we play with, of course. Yeah. And then, I mean, there is, if you brew lagers, you go much lower. You go around, say, 12 C, degrees C. Most other beers are around 20, 22 Saisons. You can decide to go 28 indeed, but then still that's a tool to play with. Yes, absolutely.
And these are commercial products. So usually they come with specifications from the yeast lab, right?
Mm.
They are
on the beer side.
not always commercial products, but often are. But you can guess and you can learn, obviously, while using them.
Yeah, so the ones now, like the commercial ones, are really much more of they're like a building block. They're the scientific, like this is your instructions for using them, whereas what you're doing with the cultures are just more kind of check and see and kind of your gut feeling.
Yes, I said too often now, I think. This is partly true, although that they promise you more than they can deliver usually for most products. Uh, but if you use non-commercial products, and you're talking about the fermentation time of a regular Saccharomyces, so therefore the beer will be done in say 4 weeks or so. You'll know after one time brewing, and if you don't, you know it after 2 times brewing how this thing is behaving, and you can taste it, you can sample it, and you can figure out very much by experience with other yeasts how to deal with it next time. If you're talking about a mixed culture, including some Brettanomyces or other yeasts, then it becomes different beast. Something I think literally every brewery is struggling with. What else? What flavors? What else is going to give you?
Yeah, yeah. That was a question I actually had here. So, like, if you've got your mixed your mixed culture, so say your kveiks or say out of Lithuania, the Lemmen's yeast, things like that, where they have that they have them from a particular farm, particular brewery, and then they've been commercialized. But when they commercialize them, all you're getting is one strain out of that culture. So I'm wondering where things lie with that, because if you're only taking one strain, it's never going to be what that whole culture was, and yet it's still marketed as being the same yeast. So I don't know what's your opinion on that. I mean, it seems, I don't know, it doesn't seem very honest somehow.
I mean, it can be a bit of a hornet's nest actually, that because some people in Norway think that these yeast labs, especially in America, that have taken single isolates of kveik and massively marketed as kveik, and feel that this is dishonest in some way to the tradition. But actually, most of the people who own these kveiks have, because Lars Marius, when he collected them initially, he asked them, can this yeast be used by others? Can it be used by amateurs? Can it be used by professional brewers? Can they use your name? So he asked them all these questions, and then they signed for it. And he has this ledger on his page where you can actually see which ones you can use. But I also understand why. First of all, the yeast laboratories can't just take the whole culture and make that a commercial product, because they also will have a really problem with having consistency as well. I mean, we're talking, some of these have 3-4 different Saccharomyces strains in them, but some have found up to like 16 different Saccharomyces strains. Some have some bacteria. We don't know exactly what they're doing to create the flavor. And to propagate this and sell it as a commercial product that way is very complex, at least for brewers that are looking for a consistency.
Yeah.
So it's a complex issue, but I would say that kveik wouldn't be as well known as it is today if it weren't for those Canadian-American yeast laboratories creating these products. I have no ill will towards that at all. I mean, we are a source of quite controversial kveik isolate ourselves, actually. I gave a bottle to an American guy who owns Yeast Lab in Amsterdam, actually. It was Jan's fault. He put us together by arranging his festival. And he isolated a Saccharomyces strain from our house culture that you could ferment at really warm temperature, like 35 degrees, and it makes a super clean flavor, almost like a lager. We call it like a pseudo lager. So this is a super popular homebrew strain in America now, and they called it the Oslo yeast or the Oslo kveik. And a lot of people on the west side of the country got really pissed off for that. There's no kveik from Oslo. Oh, you ripped us off. And they were like, why don't you mention the original source? And the problem was that we didn't actually know. I mean, at the time we had 5 different kveik cultures mixed together. So we could never know which one of those farms that isolate came from. And then the producer took a decision to call it Oslo. We probably wouldn't have done that, but that's the story. And yeah, people still hate on that on the internet, so that's fun. But I think one world doesn't exclude the other. We need the yeast labs. We need these single cultures for production. We all have different needs as producers. But of course, it's a fantastic treasure that the people of Western Norway have kept alive these cultures. And we have to like dwell on the fact that for those to be alive today, people have to have continuously brewed with them for hundreds of years. Like they kept up the responsibility to keep it alive, and that needs to be recognized for sure.
Yeah, a lot of those farmers, if I remember my reading on it properly, a lot of them actually have maybe not. Okay, I've got to rephrase this so that I think about this. But a lot of the farmers, they still brew, say the raw ales and that, but they went to taking commercial yeast as well, didn't they?
Well, it's different in different places actually. You have the smoky beer of the Trondheim region. They have lost their kveik, so they don't actually have a farmhouse yeast. They used to get lager yeast from a local lager brewery, but now they use like USO5 neutral ale yeast, for instance. But they make their own malts. So they actually either grow the grain themselves, the barley, or they buy it from a local farmer, and then they malt it and dry it under alderwood, the traditional way. So they have kept that part of the culture. And then you have the raw beer brewers in Hornindal, which don't actually boil the wort, and they have their own culture. So they've kept that part, but they use commercial malts. So you have these little dots around the country, especially on the west side and in Trondheim, where they all kept their little part of the culture, but some of it has been modified in a way. Like that's the way with everything, right? It's everything is a snapshot. Everything evolves in a way.
But these people don't use kveik from other regions.
Some of the brewers in Trondheim have now experimented using kveik from Hornindal because they came together at this farmhouse festival, which is called Kornølfestivalen, which Lars Marius is part of arranging. I was on the board until 2 years ago as well. And the goal there is to bring all these regions together. And of course, they will learn from each other. And some of these brewers from Trondheim, oh, you have yeast, maybe we can try that. But also, they're quite apprehensive of changing the way they brew the beer. Because
so they prefer a commercial USO5.
Sorry?
Are you saying they prefer a commercial USO5 because it gives them better results?
Yes, and also they don't really innovate on this product. Like they brew it as they've always done it. It's like making the Christmas ham. Like you make it this way because you do it every year, and the mindset isn't there of improving or enhancing. Maybe it's just the way we brew the beer, basically.
The mindset is there's not a mindset either to make a how to say it's like a more Norwegian product.
No, that is more the sphere of the professional brewers, I think. Gotcha. I mean, this brewing tradition, it's more about like any other food or drink tradition that we do for Christmas. A lot of us, right? Like we do it because what we always done is part of the feeling of Christmas, and like they don't think like we professional brewers do usually.
It's not about heritage; it's about tradition.
Yeah, well, it can be both, right? But yeah, I mean, some of them remember having their own kveik, but I mean, for Trondheim, I think they lost it in the early 70s. So a lot of the brewers now won't actually remember using anything else than the local lager brewery yeast. So it all depends on what's tradition to them, right?
Yeah.
And what's the tradition like on cider? Like cider's obviously been, been made for a while. But was there a tradition of any kind of local ciders where they might have used their own yeast on either Liam or James there?
Yeah, so the thing about cider making in Ireland is that its tradition has been fairly poor, like, strictly speaking. It's only in the last 10 years that craft cider making has actually taken hold substantially in Ireland. Prior to that, then you've had the big company Bulmers, which was the main cider producer in Ireland. Now there was one or two other companies that did cider, but they were all done on the commercial level. Now, interestingly enough, Bulmers, when it originally started in Clonmel, they used to use timber vats in there, and they were massive. Some of them used to hold 60,000 gallons. In those vats, they had a very particular type of yeast that was consistent to that brand of cider making, and every year they used to use that. Now I know from history or from other people that were working in this industry, they put a huge amount of effort, resources, and science into actually trying to isolate that type of yeast and harvest that yeast, so that now they've brought that yeast from that facility, which is now defunct. It's actually closed, to the new facility outside Clonmel, where it's all stainless steel and tank now. But they bought that yeast from there, from the original, to the new plant, and they grow up that yeast and develop it. But if you're looking back at, we said, very traditional cider making in Ireland, it's quite difficult to find it. Mark Jenkins, another cider maker in Slane and County Kildare, he's absolutely a beautiful cider maker. He makes a French style cider called kveik, and he's excellent at it. He also uses a wild yeast all the time, and his yeast has been he's brought that yeast on through his own facility, but he's got a beautiful yeast within that facility. You know what I mean?
Right. So that's kind of the same thing. It's a house yeast then that is just like what you're trying to develop as well. Just
yes,
yeast that you're growing and kind of domesticating, I suppose, is probably the best thing.
But I'd go back on what Jan said earlier. Like, I mean, I'm not we do use commercial yeast, and we do like some. As Liam said there earlier, we've identified some strains of commercial yeast that we find are excellent and produce beautifully crisp, really lovely ciders in their own right, and we do use those ones as well. Like, so it's about marrying the complexities of a single strain with what else we're doing. And because we have about 8 or 9 different products that we're working with, and like we're trying to target the yeast selection towards those product developments as well, so that we're kind of bringing different characters, similar to what the lads are doing in beers and beer styles. You know, so I mean, I'm sure they have different yeast for different styles of beer that they're using, and we're doing the same thing. But as Jan said, Yam, is that correct? Yeah. We do use single variety commercial yeast styles, and we do find some of them are absolutely fabulous. Like,
yeah, I guess that the problem, like you said, with it is that whereas the beer, the brewers can kind of brew different batches every couple of weeks, and they can experiment with different things. You have the problem of basically doing it once a year.
Exactly. Yeah.
And spontaneously fermenting cider, isn't that a somewhat common thing either?
Pardon, sorry, yeah.
Spontaneously fermenting your cider with the yeast on the fruit. How common or uncommon is that?
So in Ireland we have probably about 14 craft cider producers in Ireland at the moment, and only is it 3 of them, and to my best of my knowledge, 3 of them are using wild yeast fermentations. I suppose the problem we find with wild yeast fermentations is that it's not delivering the consistency in the product that Liam was referring to earlier, and it's creating more of these funky type styles. Now, our market is too small for us to be playing with that. We're playing with that kind of thing. You know, we don't, as Amund said, that, like, you know, this acquired style of taste, you know, acquired taste for a particular style of cider. Our markets are just too small for us to be trying to tap into that niche market. We just wouldn't make any money at it, like, you know what I mean? So, and we're trying to do is we're trying to bring the consistency, bring the quality with that consistency as well to appeal to a mass market. The mass market in Ireland being very small.
But is that only a consistency thing, or also a time-consuming issue, perhaps?
Very much consistency number one, right?
Yeah.
And I suppose time consuming it's not any more time consuming because, all right, I do these trials at home myself, so I kind of enjoy it as a hobby as well as everything else. And if I come across something that I'm doing at home that we can bring to the cidery and bring it in an efficient manner that doesn't dictate, you know, doesn't take from time or cost too much money, then we can implement these things quite quickly. But I mean, there's no way we can do that kind of trialing in cider because it just takes too long and you're playing with it too much. It's just that I'm interested in doing it. I enjoy doing it at home, and I do it as a hobby as well. So it just kind of all works together.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's like you said, the cider market is small, but well, I suppose that the market in Ireland for kind of spontaneous beers is probably small as well. So I was saying whether you could kind of target some of those, but it's probably a small market as well.
I leave that to Liam. He's the salesman.
No, I'm trying to put the reins on James and hold him back. He wants to create all of these funky, crazy ciders, and I'm saying, "Oh, listen, come here."
I don't know. I think there's a whole new market there for you. Not huge, but maybe it's big enough.
Yeah.
And it's I don't know. It's been very interesting for me getting kind of the cross opinions on this. Where do you think it's a culture? Like I said, I suppose I'm bringing it back around a little bit because I kind of asked this, but like there is the whole. It's like a culture of the, you know, spontaneous, the kind of complex beers versus the much bigger market of people who don't know anything about yeast and don't know anything about it and just take the beer. Do you think it seems to me like it's growing, that there is an awful lot more interest in it, like you said, where do you think it's going to go in either beer or cider? Do you think it's going to continue in that growing, or is it going to kind of hit a wall where you just don't have people who care anymore?
As for beer, because there's a much bigger interest in beer than there was, say, 15 years ago or so, at the start of the craft beer revolution, whatever they call it. I myself have been a bit disillusioned by the amount of people that came to that beer scene, and I'm actually hardly interested in experimenting different tastes in general, to be honest. They were just happy to switch from the lager to the IPA, to put it a bit boldly, that is. But then if you see the amount of people who are drinking their specialty beers nowadays, like, I can't talk about cider, I'm afraid. I think there's limits, unless people really are willing to learn, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like when you look at it, the craft beer, like I said, it's all, or it was initially, it was all IPAs, and that's all people were, probably still are, is just like the hops that are being used, and very, by knowing what hops, they know everything about beer with them. Whereas, there's this whole area, yeast, just, I don't know, like, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, basically, but like that, you know, like you said, you put on all the malts, all the yeasts, all the hops you use, whereas most of the time people are just looking at the hops.
But even that, well, I'm not sure it's such a question, but I think many people who consider themselves beer geeks or something alike, they don't really care about much else than having something special they can, or hyped, or hard to get to show off with, or otherwise something easy drinking, like a juicy IPA. And that those are great beers. Nothing wrong with that. But I give up on believing that the current beer scene. I can't predict the future, of course, but the current beer scene is not really interested in very deeper, more complex flavors. I fear.
I think there's.
I'm willing to hope.
Sorry, James, you're saying?
Yeah, I think if I look at the whole thing, or the global thing of a cider maker, and I'm sure this applies to the beer people as well. That yeast is only one. Yeast is only one aspect of our cider making, and like we have multiple aspects in the cider making that impact on the overall quality and the finish of our product. Like, and yeast is only one part of this, and I think is what we're trying to do is like look at this as one part of a multiple part. Like it's attention to detail, like, and trying to achieve the maximum quality of a very good product is about the attention to detail of all the different elements that are involved. Yeast is only one of those elements, and like the quality of the apples coming in from the farmer, the way we crush the apple, the way we have the way we look after the juice, trying to keep the place clean and tidy, and then doing the fermentation right, pitching it at the right temperature, making sure the yeast doesn't get stressed. All these elements, they're all combined to try and make a finished product that will sell it to the consumer at the end of the day. So you're not trying to create something that's way off out there that you won't get any sales for, like. But it comes back to trying to have the attention to detail and all the different elements. Yeast is just one of those elements, I think, and even the packaging, the beer, the cider is an important element as well. Like, so it's just one of a multiple of elements that we all have to try and get right all of the time. Like,
yeah. I mean, you're probably you're probably the one who has probably gone wildest on this and has the most niche market possible.
I think sour beer is growing in Norway, but it's still a very small category. And if you compare this to music, for instance, like you will have your mass market hit songs, and you have different subgenres, and people will find what they like. I think what we stand for with what we do is that we create a product that adds to diversity. To be honest, like in beer now, it's very much assimilating. Even in craft beer, it's assimilating in a way that a lot of breweries all over the world are making the same beer styles with the same raw material. And to be honest, like that is a slight problem if you value diversity. So our sort of mission statement is to at least do our part to be diversity. We will never. I mean, this doesn't really scale up in a way that we could have this producing millions of liters a year. So it is made for a small size, and we make beer that fits a niche group of people, but it's growing slightly bigger. But that's what we want to do, right? That's our mission, and that's the beer we want to make. And I do believe that there is a certain responsibility on producers to decide what do you want to make. Like I meet a lot of producers that kind of desperately trying to figure out what the market wants, and that is of course important. But there's also this element of what do you want to make. Like the market is diverse still, so I mean there is wiggle room, and of course there is always an easier path and there are harder paths, but you have options, and I think it's important to remember for us producers.
So as much ambition as anything else, and I suppose that's where I guess we kind of started off with, like on the yeast itself. I remember asking, like, was it being driven by the consumer or by the producer? And it's at least the majority of it seems to be about the producer. You're doing what you want to do. On all levels, like the whole idea, what you want to do with your own experimentation, and then just tailoring that to make sure you can actually sell some of it.
Yeah, but Brian, can I just come in? Sorry, my connection went low there. But just in relation to that, I think you hit the nail on the head. Look, I suppose the beer market is so well developed that consumers now understand like the differences that yeast will have to the beer. You know, in Ireland we don't have that heritage at all, and maybe in the UK it's a bit more developed, but I don't really think it is. But the point is that it's the producer who's driving the market, and it's the producer who's playing around with lots of stuff in the background. And I suppose once we get very comfortable with our yeasts and see that there's a significant difference in the same apple same apple cider, and if you use a different yeast in it, then we'll start to promote that and start to kind of bring that to the consumer. But we're actually a long way from that. But I think it's all going to be driven by the producer.
Right.
Once the market is there and once the consumer is interested in that.
But I said earlier, like education. So Jan was saying, like educating people what's there and what's different, but it's driven by what you want to experiment with and that what you the craft basically rather than
yes, exactly, yeah.
I suppose also you want to make it regardless of growth. I don't know how important growth actually is, or how many more consumers you want to reach. I suppose you want. You just want to make a better product. Or the best product you can.
Yes, that's true. That's
why you work with the best ingredients or a diversity of the ingredients you can work with.
Yes.
That's the drive.
That's the drive, exactly. We just want to make it as best as we can, and we're always pushing ourselves forward. Yeah.
And is that what you see? And with all the brewers who come to Carnivale Brettanomyces, do they all have that? It's the same attitude, is it?
That's what we're aiming for. That's what I see often. Yeah, most of the time. Definitely.
Good. Well, listen, guys, I've told you're nearly an hour and a half now, so I suppose I better let you go. You probably the two lads here probably want to go and watch rugby or something.
Yeah.
Ireland are playing England for the two of you who don't know. So we'll have to go, and that'll be starting in about 15 minutes or so. So listen, I just want to say thanks a million. Did I leave out? Did we not cover something that we should have covered, or some question that somebody didn't have, or anything?
Oh, yeah, he scratched the surface on yeast. We didn't even get into it at all.
We'll have to come back again sometime. By the way, the one I found there, James, was WHC Lab. I don't know if you...
Okay.
Yeah, I'll have a look at it there. I'll make a note of it here. Thank you for that.
WHClab.com. I don't know. All I know is that I've heard them mentioned a few times, and they're supposedly pretty good, and they're in Ireland. So
thank you. Brilliant.
Okay, so guys, listen. Like I said, we probably haven't touched on anything you wanted to ask. Not enough, but maybe you can keep in touch, and maybe we can see some sort of kveik turn up in cider sometime or something. You'll heat it all up. There's cider handbook.
Yeah. Actually, great book it gives a lot of detail on the yeast that they're using in the cider industry in that book. So there is.
Okay.
So it's very good, and it kind of covers a lot about the tannins and stuff as well. Like, so it's an interesting read, and it can be downloaded online.
Okay, well that's good. So listen, I'll say goodbye. What I'm going to just tell you is that next week we actually got a weekend of stuff on African brewing in conjunction with the Chicago Brewseum. So we're going to have, Saturday we have talking about traditional African brewing with some brewers from Africa. Sunday we're going to be talking then about where craft brewing is in Africa today and where its potential is. And then Monday in Chicago, then they'll link in with this, and they have some American brewers with African heritage and where the influences are coming for them. So it should be an interesting weekend if anybody wants to pop along and see it. And the replays will be available like this one will. So I'm going to play a little video on that, just a little promo video on that. And I'll just say thanks again, Jan, Amund, James, Liam. It was a pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, Brian.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Let's play this out.